Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Congregation KINS Wednesday evening Parsha class. This week's Parsha is, of course, the Parsha of Ki Tavo. When the Jews, the mitzvah we have of when Jews enter Eretz Israel, virtually immediately they have the mitzvah of bikurim, of bringing the first fruits. They also have mitzvot of maser, etc. But this evening, we're going to focus on the very first mitzvah of this parsha, which is the mitzvah of hava'at bikurim, bringing a bikurim, and then, along with it, making a proclamation associated with it. Now, the mitzvah, once again, just as we have with Maser Sheni, we have an obligation to go to Yerushalayim, to be there as much as possible. And as I mentioned, actually, in previous parshiot, one of the byproducts, one of the most important byproducts of the mitzvah of going to Yerushalayim with Maser Sheni, and now here also with Bikurim, is that Jews should imbibe the atmosphere of Yerushalayim. And I had mentioned before, and I'm not going to elaborate on it now, but just standing at a bus stop in Yerushalayim, or walking the streets of Yerushalayim, one can feel the electricity, the spiritual dynamism of the streets of Yerushalayim. Even waiting for a bus, I would meet people of great spiritual and intellectual stature, and that rubs off. And once you have the mitzvah of going to Yerushalayim, as the Sefer HaChinuch says, it's a mitzvah. When you come back to the family, and you tell them what it was like to be in Yerushalayim, and the beauty of Yerushalayim, and that in effect has a powerful influence upon members of that family, and of course then it expands to other domains as well. So the mitzvah is to go to Yerushalayim and to present the bikurim, the first fruits, to the Kohen. And it's interesting that the Mishnah tell us that how it's to be done. You look and find various different fruits, especially the fruits shenishtabcha bahem Eretz Israel, that Eretz Israel derives from them the prestige of the seven fruits, and one is then to bind as soon as they find the earliest blossomed fruit that which is to be edible. That's when they put it's called gemi, which would be a form of a substance that can bind it, and so that it's identifiable. And then one brings these various fruits to Yerushalayim. Now, today we're going to see several things. One is we're going to begin by seeing what Abravanel does in mentioning this mitzvah itself. Now, Abravanel had the great advantage. He lived, of course, first in Spain, first on the Iberian Peninsula, first in Portugal, and there he was a member of a very, very prestigious family. But unfortunately, in 1485, Abravanel was born, I believe, in 1438. In 1485, the Spanish government actually instituted an inquisition by which Jews were designated and limited, and in some cases sent into exile. Abravanel, fearing for his life, even though he was very prominent there, he was blessed with a brilliant financial mind, and among other things, of course, a Torah mind too. But he was blessed with a financial mind. He ran across the border. He ran east across the border, and was welcomed with open arms in Spain in 1485. Sadly, we know that within 7 years, of course, he would have to make a similar journey to leave Spain, and as did almost all of his brethren. And of course, to this day, Spain has suffered for what they did, not only from a, shall we say, from a decree on high, but simply they lost their base, their financial and economic base, and it took them years and years to even get their heads above water. At any rate, Abravanel wrote much of his parish when he actually, after he left Spain itself, but some of it was written before. And I'm going to read for you what he wrote concerning the mitzvah of Bikurim. One of the unique aspects of the mitzvah of Bikurim is, aside from bringing those very fruits to Yerushalayim and grains to Yerushalayim, he was to present it to the Kohen, a basket to the Kohen, and then the Kohen was to take it, and of course in a very ceremonial fashion, and he was to wave it in all the directions, indicating that Kodesh Baruch Hu is the source of all of the bounty that we may have, and then the Jew, the owner of the grains and the fruits, now makes a proclamation. We're going to first, before we do the Abravanel, we're going to read a portion of the proclamation itself, which is made. It is interesting that most of our mitzvot do not have a verbal component. Of course, the most obvious parallel mitzvah that we have is the mitzvah of the Haggadah, the mitzvah of Sipur, Yetziat Mitzrayim. There is a mitzvah to verbalize the events that took place in Mitzrayim, to sing Shira as we do on Pesach night. But generally speaking, here, this particular proclamation, which clearly involves HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the master and the architect of Jewish history, nevertheless, it doesn't mention a lot of praise. It simply sets down the story. Rabbi Yosher Ber Soloveitchik mentions that the two are parallel, the Shira in the Haggadah and the Bikurim in Eretz Yisrael, and especially the bringing of the Bikurim in Eretz Yisrael, which is primarily historical documentation of what the Jews went through, is just that. It's the retelling of the story. And Rabbi Soloveitchik says, in certain instances, the retelling of the story is in itself the praise. It doesn't need a separate one. If you think about it, we have a similar concept with Purim, right? There is no mitzvah of Hallel on Purim. On Pesach there is, but on Purim there's no mitzvah of Hallel. And the Gemara says that the story of the Megillah itself, the Megillah story, even though Hashem Yisborach is not mentioned at all in the Megillah, the Gemara says, Zohi halalta. That is the Hallel. That is the praise. The story itself is the praise. So we have a similar incidents here. Now, I'm going to read just a little bit of the proclamation, and you can see that it is a historical recounting of the Jewish travail in Mitzrayim, the fact that it was the fulfillment of the first part of the Jewish peoples coming into Eretz Yisrael. If you recall, which I'm sure you do, we have in Sefer Bereshit, in Perek Tetvav, chapter 15, we have few sentences, but they are the foundation, the bedrock of Jewish history, and those sentences are what we call those psukim are the Brit Bein Abatarim. That becomes the foundation of the relationship between Hashem, Avram, and the Jewish people. And then, of course, it is also at the same time, it is the very foundation and the starting point for the Jewish coming into Eretz Yisrael. But the condition is first they had to go the Eretz Lo Lahem. They had to be enslaved, and they had to be punished, or whether it's punishment or whether it is they had to suffer. But they had to suffer, as Chazal say, the Eretz Lo Lahem, in a land that they were unfamiliar with, and the culture they were unfamiliar with, and that was Egypt. That simply was Egypt. Once the first condition was set of the Jews going into, shall we say, a spiritual exile in Mitzrayim, when they left, now the stage is set for Jews to come into Eretz Yisrael, and that's why the Bikurim proclamation is really starts and is primarily involved with the travail and the difficulty in Mitzrayim, because it was a necessary component for Jews to take full possession of Eretz Yisrael, both the fruits and the land itself. And so the Torah tells us in the proclamation, Vayoreu otanu, the Egyptians, the Egyptians demonized and afflicted us, and they placed us under very great hardship, as we all know. We have it not only as again now, but of course we all know it from the Seder. It's probably the most widely understood aspect of Jewish history, whether for Jews who are observant or not, if you're at a Seder, so you get the history lesson. And then Hashem, in one pasuk, Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, brought us to this place. That's what the person who brings the Perot says, to the land Eretz Zavat Chalav Udavash, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And now, says the person who brings the fruit, who brings the gift, so to speak, to the Kohen, I brought the very first fruits of the land. Fruits here in this case means not just fruits as in trees, but anything which the land produces. Asher natata li Hashem, which you gave me, v'hinachto l'vnei Hashem elokecha. All right, and then you shall place it before Hashem, meaning to say in the Beit HaMikdash, and then you shall rejoice. V'samachta b'chol hatov asher natata lecha Hashem elokecha, asher natan lecha Hashem elokecha, that Hashem has given you. Now it's interesting here, v'samachta. Rabbi Jonathan B. Sachs mentions that simcha seems to be the overwhelming component of the Jewish psyche, collectively and as individuals. The inyan of simcha is something which is again a chief component of the Jewish collective national personality. Asher natan lecha Hashem, which is Hashem is giving you, uleveitecha ata v'alevi, and of course, as always, the Torah tells us, you shall not do this alone. Ata v'alevi v'ager asher b'shorecha, asher b'kirbecha. You shall rejoice with the people either who are less fortunate than you, or who do not. The ger is a person who really, this doesn't seem to apply. This entire historical record, because after all, his ancestors prior to Avraham Avinu, and even up until within maybe even within a year of this proclamation, were all people, many of them were idol worshippers, and the Levi and the Ger, and you are to rejoice with them. Jews are happy or need to be happy and need to celebrate through making other people happy. And I oftentimes quote Herman Melville, who wrote a short story, which wasn't so short, it was relatively long, called Bartleby the Scrivener. Some of you may well have read it. And Bartleby was a very unpleasant man. He lived by himself, worked by himself. He was very blunt in his relationship, even with his boss. If he'd be given certain things that he didn't like, most of us would just do it, grin and bear it. He said, "I'd prefer not to." All right. And Melville, in the middle of the story, says, "Happiness loves the light, so we deem that the world is gay," meaning to say, because happiness is truly happiness when it's shared with people, when it's shared with them. So happiness loves the light meaning to say people who are happy and joy together. So and that makes us deem that the world is gay. Gay, of course, not in its perverted meaning today, but in its original meaning means to say that the world is happy. When you're surrounded by people, you're happy, right? But misery hides aloof, said Melville. But misery, loneliness, unhappiness, sadness, right? That hides aloof. It means to say the person who is sad and unhappy, so he's alone. So we deem that misery there is none. So when a person is sad, they often find themselves in their own home, and in the words from talking already, in the words of Simon and Garfunkel, they once wrote a beautiful poem, which is a song called "A Most Peculiar Man," right? And they talked about he died, and the story takes place in the hours after his death. And in it, Simon and Garfunkel, both two nice Jewish boys, I don't know from, but nice, they wrote, he lived alone within his house, within his room, within himself. That capsulizes everything. So, of course, at a time, whether it's Pesach or other times when we can be happy, it's good for us to be able to share. That's essentially what the proclamation is. Now, who brings the fruit? We know the person who owns the land brings the fruit, but does everybody make the proclamation? Because in the proclamation, it talks about the land, Asher Nishba Lavoteinu, sworn to our ancestors. So does that mean a person who's a ger does not recite the proclamation? In fact, that question is the subject of a dispute as to whether people who are gerim, themselves gerim, at very least themselves are gerim, whether they bring at all, and if they do bring, do they make the proclamation? That, in fact, is a machloket in terms of tzak. It says, some people say, actually it's a Medrash Tanoim, and Devarim says, yes, they bring and they also make the proclamation, but it's not true. So the Medrash says, yeah, it is true. Definitely is true. Because Avram Avinu originally was called Avram. And then, of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu changed his name to Avraham, Av Hamon Goyim. So he will be the progenitor of the masses of people, spiritually, if not physically. And therefore, the ger should not only bring his first fruits, but also he should make the proclamation that we find. Others, and the Rambam paskins like that. However, others disagree. Emir Hashem ben Herav Yamenu, we will get a psak when people really can bring the Bikurim to Yerushalayim. But in either case, they bring, and a proclamation is at least set forth. Now, also probably the question is here: this machloket does have to do with what is the most important thing. To say something which is actually historically accurate, which of course the Ger cannot really say historically in an accurate sense that he was that Hashem promised to his ancestors, or do we say no? The issue here is we are all one people now, and therefore he can say along with everybody else. That in fact Avram Avinu was our ancestor. Sarah Imenu was our ancestor, and so that's machloka. That's really what it boils down to. I was thinking that a similar idea applies. For example, when a person is making brachot in the morning, can a blind person make a bracha? Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Can he make that bracha? After all, he can't see. So we paskin that in fact he can, because the bracha itself is about the concept of people being able to see. So if that's the case, we could expand that and say that the ger, whether or not he is genetically associated with Avram, or just in terms of his adopting Avram Avinu, in this case, he would be adopting Avram Avinu, that would be sufficient. Okay, that takes care of that. Now, Abravanel. Abravanel, as I mentioned earlier, he lived in the 15th century, late 15th, early 16th century. He had the advantage of seeing Rishonim before him. He's considered by most people the first of the Acharonim. Now, there is no magic line where we draw a line and say Rishon, Achron, but he probably, you could say that he was either the last of the Rishonim or the first of the Acharonim, but in either case, he was sitting on a very high perch in terms of his ability to look back and see what everybody said about things. And he was a great admirer of the Rambam, which, of course, that admiration is shared by many, many people in many, many generations. The Rambam wrote Moreh Nevuchim. We're not going to go into its origin now, but he wrote it, and it was basically and primarily a philosophical work in which the Rambam sought to in some way have a connection and I think we would have to say a recognition of in some way, shape, or form the ideas of Aristotle and Judaism, to show that in fact the two are not antithetical. Well, that didn't work so well. Most of us nowadays, most of that aspect of the great Rambam is rejected, but not all of Moreh Nevuchim at all. And Abravanel, in explaining this powerful mitzvah, says, there are four reasons that he found in Moreh Nevuchim, that as to why we put four byproducts of bringing the Bikurim and, of course, making the proclamation. The first, says Abravanel, is Lachnia et Yetzer Lev Adam. The first thing is for us to control our natural desire to say, Kochi va'otzim yadi asali et hachayil hazeh. I did it. This great wealth, this beautiful produce and everything else, that's the product of my energy and my abilities both physical and in terms of agriculture. But the first thing is to say no, and it's done with the first fruit. It starts with the first fruit, not the last fruit, because once we start allowing things that are inappropriate to seep in, so it's hard to remove them. So Abravanel said, actually, we're going to. It's really the Rambam. The Rambam said the first thing is that we want to that a person who brings the fruit is now acknowledging his own yetzer or subduing his own yetzer, his own inclination to claim the bounty as the product of his hand, but it's rather HaKadosh Baruch Hu that helps him. The second thing says the Rambam is Sheni Kedei Shelo Yeh Kafui Tova. Similar to this, but not the same. He shouldn't be somebody who is ungrateful. Ungrateful. Kafui Tova means to say ungrateful for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for him. And it's not just for the fruit. It's Jewish history, because remember, this proclamation is a history lesson about the Jewish people. And therefore, he has to acknowledge HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought all of this about, both that which appeared to be painful and difficult in Mitzrayim, and that which he now has, the Yagon L'Simcha. He, along with his fellow Jews, moved from sadness to joy. Thirdly, Lizkor b'mei hamenucha et hatzar she'avar alav. Sometimes, and by the way, there is a genre of thought in history. Start now. History is not so important. To look at what we have now, the rest of it, it's what it's done is done. And the Rambam says no, it's not true. That the third element, the third component of this is we don't forget the difficult times. Nizkor b'mei hamenucha et hatzar she'avar alav. We have to remember, and we all have to remember. Now, it doesn't mean that it dominates our thoughts and actions. That's not necessarily true. But we don't forget it. We put it in its appropriate place, both in our minds and in our history, and we utilize it properly. So that's the third thing. That proclamation reminds us: don't just say, "Okay, no." You have to know where you came from, and you have to know. You cannot forget Jewish history. And finally, says the Rambam, Midat ha'anava v'hashifrut teaches us humility. We have to have humility. From now, all of these are somewhat related, and that's signified by his bringing the basket on his shoulder, by giving it to the Kohen. It's not easy to part with it. You can imagine. Remember, one of the things I point out is every once in a while you'll see a small business owner. And if you walk into his office, he has framed behind his office the first dollar bill that he ever got. Now we don't deal so much in cash anymore. But when I was younger, I saw it all the time. There is something to remember. Here's where I started, and here's what God has given me, and it's a form of humility. And there is such a thing, by the way. This probably will close. So there is two things. One, there is such a thing as collective memory, that the Jewish people needs to have collective memory. It is something, first of all, it allows us to share experiences. When two people are suffering from a disease, or they're suffering from similar hardships, the expression goes, misery loves company. So the history of the Jewish people, both its magnificent elements and, of course, its hardships, we face it as a people. That's what we call collective memory. And we Jews are better at collective memory than probably just about anything else. We have to remember from whence we came, and the hardships as well as the successes. And of course, the Jewish people has had many successes, and our hardships are very well known. So that's the Rambam on this. Finally, I want to close on the Sefer Chinuch. He does something a little different from everybody else. He says, what he asks, in effect, what's the point of talking? What's the point? You need a proclamation. Everybody knows. Everybody who's been at a Seder knows. Anybody who suffered from Europe knows Europe, whether it's in Sephardic lands, Europe, wherever it may be. We know. What do we have to do? So says the Sefer Chinuch, the most important component of this ceremony is not just the bringing of the Bikurim. The most important part of this ceremony is the active verbal recognition of where we've been, where we're going, and who brought us and always guides us. And he says, since it is speech that separates human beings from all of Hashem's other creations, certainly on this earth, the speech separates us. Human beings are capable of abstract thought, of contemplating death, contemplating life, of planning. All of those things are a part of the human condition that is not really shared with other animals. Yes, other animals communicate, no question about that. That we know. But the idea of a shared collective experience, which is discussed, that's what separates us from all other beings. And so therefore, that which separates us is the greatest recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's concern for us, because he created us and created us with the power of speech, which we will talk about certainly more and more as we get closer to the Yom HaNorah. So I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom, and Emir Hashem, we'll see you next week, Parshat Nitzavim, and thank you for joining.
Shabbat Shalom.
And Todah Rabba from Northeast Ohio.
Kasha.
Thank you, Rabbi Myers.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Todah Rabba, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom Barach.
From Youngstown, Ohio.
From Youngstown, it's true, right. I'm glad I saw you again this week. Call to.